Hello again, and welcome to this video in the series that is all about empowering a league of extraordinary mothers on how to lay a strong foundation for health and happiness in your beautiful teenage daughter. My name is Edwina Murphy-Droomer, and today's interview is with Steph Lowe. Steph has a passion for spreading a positive message about real food and the incredible effect it has on performance. Steph launched the Natural Nutritionist in 2011 and is on a mission to inspire others to make health a priority in their lives. Steph's extensive nutritional experiences spans from elite athletes to schools and corporations, where she's worked with the likes of Grilled, one of my favourite go-to restaurants, to develop new menu items and educated workplaces about real food for productivity performance at work. Welcome, Steph, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to chatting today.
Yeah, me too. So what I would love to talk to you about today initially is busting a few of the really strongly held myths around food and nutrition. So probably the hottest topic in the last year or so has been fat. And I certainly grew up right through the low fat movement. My mum fed us low fat everything. And I think, as I was a teenager and a young woman, I certainly focused on low fat everything. But we now know that was probably not such a great idea. So could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic and a great one to start with because it has literally been around for the last 5 decades. So, a lot of us have been exposed to that low fat era for most of, if not all of our life. And it's a big one to break down for that reason, because it's been such a huge part of what we've been exposed to and certainly our upbringing. The story goes, essentially, it goes way back to the 50s, where Harvard researchers were paid what would be the equivalent of, I believe, $500,000 US this day to hide some of the research that sugar was a cause of inflammatory markers and obesity and the cardiovascular problems that we see today. And they presented some research that saturated fat was the cause of the problems that they were seeing in society's health back then. So essentially, science wasn't very evolved at that point in time, and all we needed were some leading researchers in the field to start to present this particular research for it to then be incorporated into our food guidelines and food pyramid. Yes. So, it's decades ago now as to where it started, but we can see that it was unfortunately the cascade for the health problems that we have in 2018. Very simply, we only need to look at human physiology to see that the brain is mostly made from fat. Our hormones are built from fat. Yep. And it is the satiety macronutrient. And what I mean by that is that when we eat the right sort of fats, we have control over our appetite and our blood sugar control and how we feel at 3:30 in the afternoon and what things we do or do not crave. So, those day-to-day things are what we're seeing as being a problem, a flow-on effect of the low-fat era. But then there's so many long-term complications that we're starting to see now with the prevalence of obesity, diabetes, and Alzheimer's, which is now being called type 3 diabetes. So it tracks back to our increase in sugar consumption, which comes back to our demonization of fat.
Yeah. I think my big wake up, I was vegetarian for about 20 years, and it was actually through a program that Cindy O'Meara runs, the 4-phase program that she has. I was trying to shift weight that I just held on to for just about all my life. And I started eating meat again and introducing a lot more fat following that process. And I lost about 17 kilos by by just not needing to eat the quantities. If we're so reliant on carbohydrate, pastas, breads, and so on, the quantities of food that I was eating, I now know were just absurd. Instead of just having, sort of avocado and eggs for breakfast, that sees me through most of the day. I last on that till dinner rather than eating, 5 times a day. So that satiety part of it is just such a big part of the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to speak to vegetarianism or veganism, it's not to say that you can't do that, but it needs to be really well formed. It needs to be well developed from the balance of macronutrients. And to clarify, when I speak about that, we're talking about carbohydrates, proteins, and fats.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, a lot of those templates are, as you say, very carbohydrate dominant. But so is the Australian food pyramid, and so is the guidelines that we're teaching our children at that school level. We know that the food pyramid is still influenced by the agricultural industry, which of course are going to tell us that we need 6 to 11 serves of whole grains per day, which means, number one, we're displacing the nutrients that we should be obtaining from plants and quality proteins and healthy fats. But two, it's perpetuating this blood sugar roller coaster. So that is what affects how we feel at school or work, and how we then make our ongoing food choices. Like, most people are quite surprised to learn that cravings are a byproduct of your previous food choices. And you probably experienced that firsthand. You've got your eggs and avocado, hopefully some veggies. You've got a really well-balanced plate for breakfast. One, you've got satiety. Two, you're not needing a nap at 3:30. And three, I bet your cravings have disappeared as well. Like, that's not a coincidence, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So it's fascinating.
Yeah.
There's a huge flow-on effect.
And that's all our little friends, all our bugs, isn't it? All the microbiome and the bacteria that we're feeding, the good versus the pathogenic, or the sugar-loving bacterias.
Yeah, that's a big part of it as well. Like, we know obviously that all disease starts in the gut, so too does all health. So we absolutely have to look at what our food choices are doing to our microbiome. We're about 1% human. We are mostly bacteria. So just think about that for a second. Like, they're the ones that are in control of our health. So absolutely, if we're following our conventional food guidelines and eating these refined carbohydrates that obviously then get converted to sugar, we're causing, an overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria, which then affects everything. Like, it's systemic, right? But it's our immune system. We know that 80% is in the gut. It's how we feel, because serotonin, our happy hormone, is produced by these beneficial bacteria, our absorption of nutrients. So, what I'm seeing a lot of is these nutrient deficiencies, which, aren't caused by a poorly planned vegan or vegetarian diet. They're actually caused by a disruption to the gut, to that internal ecosystem, which means we don't have the right balance of bacteria. We can't break down and absorb the food properly. So, the old saying, you are what you eat, should actually be you are what you absorb, because you need to get the nutrients out of the food to be able to optimize your health.
Yeah. So let's give mums a practical kind of picture. We know now that it's really important to have fat in our diet. So what does that look like, when we're putting a plate of food together, or, over the course of a day, if for themselves and for teenage girls that are in that sort of 14 to 18 age bracket? What does that look like as far as putting our meals together, Steph?
Yeah, great question. I'll start with the types of fats we should be looking for, because what we don't want to do is lead it to be assumed that all fats are good, because unfortunately there are a few distinct categories that I think are really important to clarify. So fats that we want to be avoiding are still the trans fats, and these are mostly found in, fried foods and baked goods, and definitely not under our Just Eat Real Food umbrella, but they still appear in people's, nutrition templates. So we want to be avoiding trans fats. And we really want to be avoiding the polyunsaturated seed oils like the old school canola and safflower and cottonseed, and these vegetable oils that are very toxic and high in our omega-6 fats. But we absolutely need to make sure we're getting quality omega-3s, and these come from foods like avocado, free-range eggs, olive oils, nuts, seeds, all these beautiful, natural, nutrient-dense foods. And then we have our saturated fats, and these are the ones that people, may fall off their chair to learn are actually healthy, because saturated fats are largely those that were demonized for the last 5 decades, as we were speaking of. But saturated fats are things like grass-fed butter, our pasture-raised grass-fed meats. We've got our coconut oil, our MCT or medium chain triglyceride oil, and any of the other animal fats, like, if you're cooking your duck fat potatoes and things like that, like they're actually really beautiful, nutrient-dense food. They're an absolute essential source of fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. And the research is crystal clear now. There's no link between saturated fat consumption and heart disease. And I can send you some of that research that was released in 2010 now. So it's hard to believe it was 8 years ago, but there are still people that are essentially afraid of these foods for whatever reason. Either they've been still brainwashed in that low-fat era, or perhaps it's coming from another practitioner that they're working with. But it's really important that we acknowledge the importance of these foods. So to then get practical in terms of how much to add, like that's going to be quite individual, and building your plate comes down to factors including appetite and activity levels. So your output needs to be relevant, or it needs to be relative to your output. But a good range, perhaps I'll give a range, then we can work with that, is 1 to 2 portions of fat per meal. Now, and examples of a portion would be 2 tablespoons of an olive oil, or it's 2 tablespoons of nuts and seeds, it's half a large avocado, or it's like 30 grams of a grass-fed butter or similar.
Okay. Yep.
So 1 portion per meal would be a great place to start for someone that maybe doesn't have a large appetite or isn't doing a lot of exercise. Especially if you've been eating super low fat, you won't tolerate a lot. So you don't want to jump in the deep end. I think it's important to scale things always. But then we pay attention to the magic S word, which is satiety. So if that 1 portion is still not giving you the blood sugar control and the ability to decrease your meal frequency, then I will say obviously try 2 and see if you get the 4 or 5 hours out of a meal. You're managing your appetite, your cravings, your blood sugar control, all those things we've been discussing, and that gives you a good idea as to how to scale between those 1 to 2 portions per meal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that people that I speak to often struggle with changing their meals first up. So one of the things that I like to suggest is just adding lettuce, a side bowl of lettuce with a dressing that I make, which is just with either inchi oil or olive oil and a lovely balsamic vinegar. And that, if you get your oils in there, you're also adding in some greens, and that's just, if you add that, it's a great way to start.
Yeah, beautiful. Lots of polyphenols and antioxidants and all those things we need. So, yeah, amazing.
Yeah. So I know another hot topic for many girls is calorie counting. And, I think that this is really fraught with so much danger, because, there's a certain number of calories in a lolly snake versus, real food. And so I think calorie counting can be fraught with all sorts of problems. What are your thoughts on that, Steph?
Yeah, well, it's an absolute tragic area of science that, again, was perpetuated throughout the last 5 decades. But, you know, we know a lot more, and we absolutely know that human physiology is not a mathematical equation of calories in, calories out, right? And we absolutely need to think about the quality of food. So the lolly snake that you mentioned might have less calories than an avocado, but it's very nutrient poor, and it's going to spike the fat storage hormone insulin. So that's what we need to think about when we look at real food versus refined carbohydrates, or, you know, a purely simple sugar example, is they have very different effects on our physiology. And that's important to acknowledge, because you want satiety, you want nutrients, you want blood sugar control. So if it's slightly higher in calories from a whole food source, that's actually a very good thing, because you're not going to need to eat as frequently. You've obviously got energy from your food for your brain function, for your hormones, to control how the rest of the day goes. And the irony is that if you're eating refined carbohydrates because they're low calorie, you're spiking insulin, so you're actually storing fat.
Yep.
So you're not actually creating a calorie deficit to achieve a body compositional goals. Then that's why you see people at the gym for 2 hours or burning calories, because they're trying to offset what they've eaten. When if the insulin's high, your body's in fat storage mode. So we need to educate that to create, if you do have a body compositional goal, it's all about controlling your hormones, which you do with real food, which will lower your intake of refined carbohydrates.
Yep. I think, you know, in line with this is the whole idea around intermittent fasting. And to put a more practical kind of picture on that, I know that when my kids moved from primary school, where, you know, I'd lovingly pack them a lunch, and then I'd be concerned when they got home at the end of the day if things weren't eaten. When they moved into high school, my girls actually really didn't want to take lunch to school. And there was a couple of reasons for that. One is because they're not allowed to go back into the classroom, so they've got to carry lunch boxes around, and I don't do things in packets. So that was one part of the picture. I think there's also, unfortunately, a stigma that goes around eating food for the girls, and, you know, what they're eating compared to what other girls are eating, and they just got sick of the conversation. They didn't want to have the conversation. So I had to have this mental shift for myself that they weren't going to eat lunch at school. So they would go from 7:30 in the morning until 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon with no food. And for me, it was about making sure that they have this incredible breakfast. So we always do have a cooked breakfast, which has plenty of protein and vegetable and fat and so on. And I started eating the same way, and none of us found that we were actually hungry and we didn't need to be eating. And then I, you know, started reading about intermittent fasting and how there's actually many benefits to it. So I think, you know, there's a lot of women that have grown up for these many generations where we have been, you know, the dogma has been around we need to eat 3 or 5 times a day to keep our metabolism going and all these sort of things. But I think that's another myth that we need to sort of shift. Steph, do you agree?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's an important one to cover because, you know, it's all connected. If we think about the food pyramid again, it's 6 to 11 serves of whole grains a day, which spikes your insulin, which means you're hungry, which means you need to buy muesli bars for morning tea and low-fat yogurt for afternoon tea. And so you're perpetuating or contributing back to the food industry. So, of course, they're going to try to keep that myth going, right? And then when we look a little bit deeper, we see what it does to our metabolism. So it sets us up to be sugar burning, which means then we fulfill that vicious circle where we need to snack all the time. So you're absolutely right. There are many benefits of intermittent fasting. And I think what's really important here, though, is to talk about it being very individual. You know, it's a journey to get your metabolism ready to be able to have big gaps between your meals. So I think it's important that it's done, in most cases, as an evolution, because we say that fasting is a muscle. So it's just like you hopefully wouldn't sign up to a run and do a marathon. You might do a 5K and then a 10K and then a 21K and then maybe a marathon. With fasting, you start gradual. So if, for example, you're eating every 2 hours, then, you know, the first step is to change the way you build your plate to get 3 or 4 hours, and then so on and so forth. So, you know, the gap that you mentioned between 7:30 and 3:30 isn't where I'd advise anyone to start necessarily.
Yep.
But the more important point is to acknowledge that, yes, there are absolutely benefits of intermittent fasting. Secondly, there are many variations of that. Like some people benefit from having an earlier dinner and a later breakfast, which is that longer overnight fast. Yep. But yeah, you can certainly create the window between meals. It just depends on how that feels for you. Yeah. And the other consideration around intermittent fasting that I'm really conscious of is that most of the research is conducted in men. So men are more robust than women. They don't have the menstrual cycle or the sort of 4 seasons in the month that we say that women of you know, I guess childbearing age do have. So we can't take that science that's conducted in a male and apply it directly to a female. We need to factor in things like our the time of the month, and certainly that our appetite often changes in week 4 of our cycle, that our body is under more demand, we may need more calories, so maybe we don't fast all month.
And
that's where I think perhaps it is maybe something that working with a practitioner would be really good to do, to learn more about how to put it into your world and the nuances of fasting and those other important considerations, because I don't necessarily think it is it's going to be a hard and fast rule.
Yeah, and it all comes back to just tuning into our bodies and what our bodies are telling us. I do, in, you know, following on from what you just said, I certainly find that when I have my period, I'm wanting to eat more, and I notice that in my girls as well.
And that's okay. Like, I think having hunger can sometimes be, we can be afraid of that, which I think can definitely be maybe linked up with the calorie counting or maybe some body compositional goals. But having a good metabolism and getting a little bit of appetite is to be celebrated. That means your body's very efficient, and it's good if you can periodize your intake across the month. Like if you're not hungry in week 1 or week 2, eat a little bit less, as long as you are being intuitive. And I think being really honest with yourself. Like, what I don't want to see is that intermittent fasting is like hiding a bit of orthorexia or disordered eating, and we can sort of celebrate that it's healthy. Like, sorry to be blunt, but I think veganism can sometimes be that. Like, I'm going to be vegan to save the animals, when really it's just a way to hide the disordered relationship around food. Like, I think intermittent fasting is that new potential that as a mum and as a teenager, we really need to be very honest with ourselves as to the real reason behind these decisions that we make.
And certainly if we're going to go down a path of eating a bit less food, ensuring that the food we're eating is packed full of nutrition and not nutrient devoid. Part of the picture.
Yeah, well, that's the other part. Yeah, and I think that's the thing. Like, I don't ever say to someone, you can only eat 3 meals a day, but that's the indirect result. And that's when it's so beautiful. Like, you change the way you build your plate. So we've got non-starchy veggies, quality protein, healthy fats, and then that optional whole food carbohydrate relative to the individual and things like training intensity and metabolic profile and goals. The indirect result is, I'm not hungry, so I only need to get 3 meals in a day, or 3 meals in a small snack, or 2 meals in a snack, depending on the eating window. Like, that's the flow-on effect of nutrient density, which comes back to how you build your plate.
Yeah. I think I'd like to go back to a point you talked about before with eating disorders. And, you know, I know that for so many teenage girls, it's that whole body image thing is so front and center and drives their choices. Oh, my dog is going to snore. Being part of the conversation.
Right. In the real world.
Yeah, that's right. that body image is so front and center. And I think I'd be a fool to say it's just for teenage girls. I think as women across the board, this is something that's often front and center for us and drives so many of our decisions around eating. So, when we're looking for things that might be cause for concern, what are some of the things that perhaps you mentioned veganism, but that's going to push all sorts of buttons for people, I know. I certainly see within the friends, my girls' friends at school, vegetarianism has certainly taken hold, and being vegan has become more and more popular. But what are your thoughts on vegetarian and being vegan for teenage girls?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic, and there's a lot we can unpack here, and I'll try to keep things, from that practical standpoint, because it's an individual decision. I'm very conscious of that.
Yeah.
The main points I think that are really, really key are, firstly, that yes, it comes back to that why. So if it's an ethical and an environmental and an animal sort of choice decision, then that's quite different to it being I want to weigh X kilos, or this is my goal to look like an Instagram model. And I think that's an important conversation that mothers will need to lead if their daughter is making that decision, to be able to explore a little bit more about the why, the reasons behind. And then it's got to be about the prescription of that type of decision. So obviously not just loading up on quinoa or other refined grains, where not that I have a problem with quinoa, but it's it's pretty carbohydrate dense, so it's a complete protein, so we think that it's a good choice, but it's still 66% carbohydrate, so we're not going to get the satiety and balance of nutrients. So as for a vegetarian, obviously we've still got options like including eggs, so we have to be okay with that as a protein choice, and making sure we're building our plate with at least 2 cups of vegetables per meal, and adding on those portions of fat which we spoke about earlier. But veganism is another level altogether, because it is hard to get even 20% protein. As a rough guide of your daily calories, you've got to be really aware of where those sources are coming from, and adding things like your hemp seeds and sunflower seeds, and maybe some fermented tempeh in there, and really taking ownership of making sure that if this is what you want to do, that you do it properly to balance out the total energy or calories, but absolutely that macronutrient breakdown.
Yeah.
And I think blood tests on top of that, because it's a well-known fact that vegans, may feel great initially, but 2 years down the track have some severe B12 and or iron deficiency that could have been adjusted earlier. And I'm not saying that this applies to everyone, but it's very hard to eat enough plant B12 or iron.
Yeah.
And if it's a decision you want to make, that you may need to consider supplementation, and not everyone is in love with that, with that position. But I see too many vegans with low B12 and iron that, they need to, I think, catch before it gets to those levels where the flow and effect from, obviously how we feel, our energy is dependent on ferritin and our ability to carry oxygen through the system. And B12, I'm talking damage if the levels are too low. So I don't want to be an alarmist, but it's really an important consideration.
And low B12 is fairly prolific, isn't it? It's we see a lot of.
Absolutely, and it can be avoided. So
yeah. So I guess another really hot topic is all this discussion around fermented food. And I think that, lots of people are becoming more and more aware of eating fermented foods. But I think it would be really worthwhile having a discussion, firstly, about why it's a good idea to be eating these foods and what sort of fermented foods to consider. And, in addition to that, I know that it has become a popular thing to go out and buy probiotics and so on to help our gut health. So this is obviously a massive discussion, but I think I'd really like to hear from you just your thoughts around gut health and fermented foods, and why this has become such a big topic.
Yeah, it's such a huge topic, and it's very vogue at the moment, which is, partly why we're having this conversation, because you can buy kombucha at Coles now, which is crazy to see. But to take a step back, I said earlier that all health starts in the gut. So that's what we need to remember. So I think in the broken medical model that we have, we see things being treated, either individually, like different organ systems, or we're given a pill to fix a symptom. Whereas obviously in your world and in my world, we're all root cause driven. So, everything has an origin in the gut. Mm-hmm. So that's really important to think about health and wellness, but also if there is like a symptom that we're experiencing, whether it be fatigue or bloating or seeing poor levels of vitamins and the results from a blood test because it's an absorption issue. Remember I said that we're about 1% humans. So we're literally 99% bacteria. So, that's huge when we think about the significance of the balance in that internal ecosystem. Yeah. That determines our health and wellness today, but also tomorrow. So our longevity. So what I see that has happened is, it's a super cool, trendy, vogue topic, and we see kombucha being sold in Coles, and we see this sort of self-prescription of either Inner Health Plus up to a practitioner brand, or we're drinking kombucha as the new soft drink, or we're having fermented veggies. And unfortunately, that's causing a lot of problems. So we've got to think about the internal ecosystem needs to be in balance. So it's not more is more. So it's not, I'm 99% bacteria. That means I need to drink kombucha and eat fermented veggies and have my bone broth and add in things every day, because that is what causes the problem. It can contribute to overgrowth. Yeah. So, our beneficial bacteria are a Goldilocks scenario. So not too little and not too much. So that's what I really am passionate about trying to stop. Yep. I think, one, gut health is very important, but it's a tightrope that you're going to walk between what you should actually do. Yep. So, we acknowledge the significance, but we have to start very gradually. So just for those that don't know, kombucha is a fermented tea that creates a drink that's rich in probiotic bacteria, but it needs to be fermented properly to make sure it's not got any of the sugar left in the end result. So if you're making it at home, or if you're buying like brands that don't use refined sugar like Remedy Kombucha, that's a little bit different, but there's so many brands that we may be consuming a product that's high in sugar, and then, of course, feed the pathogenic bacteria, as you mentioned earlier. So that's something to be aware of. It's kind of the reason why I don't love kombucha as the first point of call anyway, because it's very easy to drink like soft drink, and some people might only need a tablespoon or two, but the bottles come in 300 mils or larger, and it's quite easy to overdo.
I think for people that are drinking it like soft drink, they're not drinking the right kombucha, because it's not sweet.
No, it's definitely not sweet, but I think it's that behavioural replacement for a lot of people who finally learn that maybe Diet Coke and all the artificial sweeteners aren't the best decision, but that's another topic altogether. Yeah. But I think, for our audience, it's really important to have something as a starting point. And I love fermented vegetables. A really conventional example is sauerkraut, but it's obviously not as appealing to everybody as maybe a kimchi or fermented beetroot. There are brands we can buy in the fridge of the health food store, but it's very simple to make with your choice of vegetables, some salt and some TLC while you get the juices out of the vegetable and out of the vegetables and pack it into that glass jar. But all you need to do is add a tablespoon or two a day. So it's great with your eggs and veggies in the morning. You put it through a salad, or it's simply on the side with your meat and veg of an evening. And the main thing is to be able to be really intuitive with how that makes you feel. Like, I have clients in the clinic at the Natural Nutritionist that even if they add a tablespoon, they react quite violently. And that definitely shows us that there's quite a significant imbalance to that internal ecosystem. So we would explore testing for that individual. But I think starting with that small amount of fermented veggies and just making sure you pay attention to how you feel, and that you might track symptoms like energy and bowel movements and digestive response, so that it is nice and gradual and you can go from there.
So for mums that would sort of suddenly feel alarmed by a drastic response, what would that drastic response look like?
Yeah, I mean, typically we could see digestive symptoms, like it might be explosive bowels or cramps or bloating. But because we acknowledge the significance of the gut and how it impacts everything, we can often also see systemic responses like a skin breakout. Yeah. What actually happens is the addition of the good bacteria can actually start to cause, it's that reorchestration of the balance, right? And sometimes it can start to cause a die-off of the pathogenic bacteria. So these bacteria actually, as they're being killed, release neurotoxins. Yeah. And they circulate through the bloodstream. So they can cause brain fog or fatigue or changes in mood. But yeah, the skin rashes is also one of the symptoms, because they're going through the bloodstream, and the skin is the largest organ, so it manifests that way. It's actually called a Herxheimer reaction. So there's a lot of literature on it, and certainly we want to avoid that. So foundations of real food and hydration and good detox mechanisms are things that we give our clients in conjunction with starting that gut health protocol. But I'll actually say that it's really important that you do at least 4 weeks of real food. So if you're currently eating more of a food pyramid type template with refined carbs and refined sugars, do not add anything fermented or probiotic in nature until you have those building blocks of real food there first. That's very key.
It triggered a question for me, and I think that when we talk about Chinese medicine, we talk about treating like with like. So does it make sense then obviously bad skin and acne is a big thing for many girls. Is that something that you look at treating the gut to help with the skin?
So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I think about the possibility of things getting worse, but do we, that it might be that it has to get worse before it gets better? Is that what you're saying?
And that's what's really hard when it comes to the skin, because it's, a little bit of a few extra toilet trips you can kind of hide and deal with, although it's not pleasant. But when it's in the skin, and I appreciate for a teenage girl, like that's really challenging to deal with. So, yeah, I think that the conventional treatment for acne obviously puts a Band-Aid on the solution and it gets rid of maybe the visual appearance, but the irony is it makes the gut worse, so the problem's never going to go away and you're sort of stuck with that medication model. Whereas when you acknowledge that it starts in the gut and you treat that, then obviously it's root cause driven, which we know it needs to be. But yeah, like stuff might come out of the skin first. So then we would talk about the timing of that to make sure that, we consider the possibility. It's not to say that that's going to happen in everyone, but we consider the possibility and do what we can to mitigate the potential, but also that the timing, so it can be managed as well as possible. But there may never be an ideal, unfortunately, if there is that imbalance.
I don't think there's a teenage girl on the planet that's going to go, now this will be a good time to have a breakout.
I know, right? So that's the reality. But most people, I think if they're in that situation, we would definitely talk about testing. So it's stool testing that looks at the DNA of the microbes that are present, then gives us a reflection of that internal ecosystem, which then shows us what are the imbalances, which then gives us the information to develop the protocol. So we're not stabbing in the dark or flying blind. We know what the overgrowths are. We know where the undergrowths are, and then we obviously address the root cause with the goal of treating the symptom.
Doing it that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
I could talk about gut health. I just think it's so pivotal and it's so empowering, because there's so much that we can do to take control of our own health. In thinking about gut health, it's all that stuff that we can be doing at home with, eating more veggies and cutting out all the refined foods and all those things. There's no requirement for a magic pill. It is like the magic pill.
Yeah, but that's really, really important to reiterate what I just said about starting with that real food template. So it obviously depends on, where you're at right now. So if it is more food pyramid driven, then the goal might be, let's just start to reduce the packets and boxes and food that has a mascot. Yeah. And then we look to, all right, let's start to swap the refined carbohydrates for the whole food versions, like the sweet potatoes and the fruits and a little bit of quinoa or buckwheat or similar. And it's an evolution, I don't expect anyone to eat like I do or you do straight away. But it's the acknowledgement that, your health absolutely starts with the decisions about what goes on your plate. And that just eat real food is a really good mantra to summarize. Like, looking at 2 products in the supermarket, if it's in a box, it's not purely real food, but there are exceptions to the rule, and you can start to look at, all right, what's the better choice? Or on a menu, what's the better choice? What has less refined foods and more whole foods in their natural state, like how they come off a tree or out of the ground or from an animal, if that's your dietary preference, of course.
Yeah. And I think it is important also, we talk about all this physical stuff, but it's, the escalation in anxiety and other mental health things that, are causing so much concern. This gut health is all part of that picture as well, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting conversation. And I love to teach this because, as you would know, the depression and anxiety conversation has largely been about the imbalance of neurotransmitters and the prescription of pharmaceuticals to address that, which is actually being disproven, although Big Pharma are working very hard to try and hide that research. But so we know the vagus nerve runs between the brain and the gut, and that is a huge highway of communication channels between our brain and our gut and our gut and our brain. So it's so amazing to see now that we've got the science behind it, to have the research to show that we can actually start to support these conditions or symptoms by looking at the root cause, so coming back to the gut. So of course real food is a big part of it, but what we would again do is advise testing, because if someone's taking a prescription, we wouldn't ever advise that they just stop that. And it's the same with the skin conversation. If you've been prescribed a drug, you wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable just ripping the Band-Aid off, but if you start to improve the underlying environment, then you're a different person when you get to that position of exploring coming off the medication or looking for an alternative treatment. And for me, that's so exciting, because it's rampant. Anxiety and depression is so tragically high in this day and age, and to know that we have so much more control over it than we were once led to believe is phenomenal. Really, it's incredible.
I agree. I wholeheartedly agree. I think it's really exciting. I think it's really easy to get bogged down in the overwhelm of how all these different physical and mental ill health pictures are escalating, but knowing that we can, just absolutely turn this around simply through what we're putting in our mouths and the way we're moving our bodies and simple things. It's not, we don't require these magic prescriptions and so on. It's all stuff that we do every day that's going to make the big difference.
Yeah, and hopefully that information is empowering.
Yeah.
Because you've got the control.
That's right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And if we can give that control to our girls before they launch themselves into life, then their journey is just going to be so much easier.
I know. I think about that all the time. I think about the skills that, I have now and how I get to teach that to the girls that come in to work with me in the clinic. And I just think it's so amazing in this day and age that we've got this information, because when I had challenges with depression in my 20s, I was only offered a pill.
Yeah.
And that to me, I didn't actually end up taking anything, thankfully, but now we've got so much more information in front of us, and I think it's so beautiful what you're doing to get that information at the forefront, because we can treat it differently. We can treat it naturally.
Well, my reason for doing it's born from the same reasons that you talk about. I got so many things wrong, and I wish that I had had this information earlier, because it would have just been a very different picture. But then, I'm doing this because of my experiences, so it all happens for a reason.
Same. I believe that. I truly believe that.
Yeah. So, look, I think we could talk for hours, and I feel very
I know.
wind this up. We haven't even talked about sport, and that's something, we'll have to do another interview another time, Steph.
No problems. There's so much more we could discuss, but it's always important to think about the journey, and obviously, you've got to start where you are, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, I love the saying, it's a journey, not a destination. Health is a journey, not a destination. Yeah. So I know you have a lovely gift for our audience. Do you want to tell them a little bit about that before we wind up?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've created an ebook called A Real Food Family, and it is a really comprehensive guide about how to build your plate. So the macronutrients that we were talking about earlier and the healthy fats to add. We've included tips to becoming a real food family. It contains a 7-day meal plan, which is just a nice, gentle guide to start to experiment with what sort of foods we can be eating. We've got a complete shopping list and 20 real food-based recipes. So that's a beautiful place to start, and I hope it is a great education piece and inspiring to think about how beautiful real food is and how it's the foundation of health and wellness.
Perfect. That sounds so good. Thank you so much, Steph. And yeah, hopefully we'll do another one of these in the future.
Amazing. I can't wait. Thanks for having me as a part of the summit, and it's an honor to have spoken with you, and just so happy to see what you're doing and to be involved.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Steph. All right. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.